Take one. Welcome to another episode of the Creative Ops Podcast, where we follow our curiosity to explore emerging trends and bold possibilities to help us rethink what creative operations is and can be. So, what happens when creative operations becomes the cornerstone of a brand's strategic evolution? Today, we're diving into the value and potential of in-house agencies with Patrick Burgoyne. And he is no stranger to navigating complex creative landscapes. As co-founder of the in-house agency Leaders Club, he's cultivated a thriving community where transparency, collaboration, and practical solutions take center stage. He's had a storied career spanning 20 years as editor of Creative Review and a tenure as CEO of D&AD. So Patrick has been at the forefront of documenting and helping us understand creative ecosystems, past, present, and future possibilities. In this episode, we unpack the evolving role of in-house agencies. We explore the 4 buckets framework, a practical guide for mapping the evolution of in-house teams from production studios to lead agencies. We'll discuss how brands like Specsavers and Sainsbury's are redefining their creative strategies, leveraging in-house expertise and embracing new roles like creative strategists to elevate their impact. But we're not stopping there. Artificial intelligence is reshaping the creative process now, and it presents challenges and opportunities for creative teams. We discuss how AI is disrupting traditional workflows, creating efficiencies, and demanding a strategic rethink of team structures and operations. So whether you're a creative ops professional looking to adopt systems thinking, a CMO aligning creative output with business KPIs, or a technologist exploring how to streamline operations with emerging tools, this episode is packed with thought-provoking insights. And remember, stay tuned after my interview with Patrick for reflection questions, prompts to spark meaningful discussions with your team and challenge your own thinking. Patrick, welcome to the Creative Ops Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Nish. I feel very honored to be on the show.
Excellent. I've been looking forward to this conversation. So today we're going to be talking about all things in-house agencies. You're going to bring a UK perspective, but I think it's going to be valuable to listeners that we have in North America, Australia, and other parts of the world as well. Incredibly valuable because you and I have had a couple of chats beforehand and gone back and forth on LinkedIn. So I'm really looking forward to sharing your insights with the audience today. But before we sort of jump into some of the things we're going to talk about, like why there's been this trend towards in-housing, trust and collaboration. And of course, we can't have any episode without talking about our 2 favorite vowels, A and I, artificial intelligence. Tell us about a little bit about the in-house agency Leaders Club. What prompted it to start? Who's sort of involved in it in terms of some of the brands that the global audience might be familiar with, and what are some of the things that the organization is focused on doing?
Sure, thank you very much. So we've been going now for I think nearly 4 years. My background is I was a journalist for 25 years. I was editor of a magazine called Creative Review for about 20 of those years, which hopefully some of your audience will be familiar with. If not, it's a magazine for the design and advertising and creative industries. And while I was still there, we did a few events targeted at the in-house community. And I was just so struck by the kind of enthusiasm they had for getting together and talking to one another and hearing about how they were facing similar challenges and solving some of those challenges. So I kind of carried that with me after I left Creative Review, which is like 6 years ago now. And then I was having a chat with a really old friend of mine, John Owen, who's a partner at a consultancy called WDC. And they work with a lot of in-house agencies and marketing departments, help them build in-house teams or step in when things are going wrong and help them fix those issues, or they help in-house agencies that are expanding their remit or changing their remit. And he was saying to me, look, there's nowhere for the people that we talk to kind of meet each other. There's no place to do that. There are organizations that allow that in in the US, for example, but there's nothing in the UK that we know of. Do you fancy starting something? So it sounded really interesting. I sort of spent way too much time than is good for anyone on LinkedIn, contacting people and just saying, look, thinking of starting this thing. Do you think it sounds interesting? Kind of looking at brands and thinking, I wonder if they have an in-house team. Do they have a creative director? Do they have an operations director? Oh yeah, okay, maybe putting a LinkedIn group together. And then we just started. I think it was still COVID in those times. So we started with some online events because it didn't cost anything. And we got immediately people like Specsavers and Lego and InBev, AB InBev, who came on and just talked about what it's like running an in-house agency. And relatively soon, we were able to get some sponsorship support on board. We were really grateful that Adobe helped us with that. And that meant that we could start doing in-person events, so we could pay for venues and catering and all that stuff. And, you know, we set iHalk up as an independent business. So it's a standalone business. WDC are our kind of sister company, which is great for me because they are kind of at the coalface working with in-house agencies every day. So they can kind of tell me, look, these are the issues that we know people are really struggling with. You should probably do an event on this or a piece of research on this or whatever. So that kind of relationship works really well. But as far as iHalk's concerned, we're a completely independent organization. We started paid for membership last year, which has been great, really helps us with our kind of planning and so on. And we have members across all sectors. So we have, you know, financial services, we have media companies, we have charities, we have big retailers, supermarkets, the kind of people that come to our events, you know, very familiar brands for people like Citibank or Three or Full Creative or BBC or ITV or supermarkets like Ocado, Sainsbury's. It by and large is larger organizations, I would say, mostly commercial organizations, though we do have some charities as well and arts organizations. It's a very nice mix of different kind of organizations, different stages of their in-house kind of journey, if we can say that, or certainly their kind of capabilities. So we have people who are maybe more a kind of production studio, all the way up to the likes of Specsavers, who we would, you know, classify as a lead agency in-house, who do almost everything. And what's lovely about the community is there's a real sense of transparency and openness, and we call our events a kind of safe space where people are very happy to share their challenges, actually, as well as the good things. And you get this really, really nice sharing and ability for people to say, well, I'm really struggling with this. How did you do that? How did you cope with that? Really, I see iHalk as, we don't have an opinion on this stuff. I'm not qualified to tell you what you should be doing with your in-house agency. What we are about is providing that space where in-house agency leaders across operations, creative, strategy, production, brand can figure that stuff out for themselves by talking to their peers at other organizations. That's essentially what we provide.
I think that's fantastic. And so, in the name of your organization is club, and you use the word community a couple of times. And I think that's so key today in a world that's, you know, awash with so much change, is that ability to go. There's lots of good conferences out there where you get these sparks of perhaps inspiration, I'll call it, but it stays at the surface level because it's a 20-minute or 40-minute presentation or panel discussion. And what I've, you know, through our discussions and what I've heard from others like Julia Aronson at Specsavers, who's going to be on in a couple of weeks.
Oh, great.
They really value that ability to sit down and have that in-depth conversation. And as you said, sort of share the, how shall I say, like the ugly details of here's how we got to successful, like the things we had to work through. Like it's like anything else in life. We all look at I almost liken the conference presentations to somebody's Instagram feed. We see them when they're picture perfect, and we go, oh, I want that. But then we go, oh, but how do they actually get there? What was the work that had to go into it? What were the failings and learnings along the way? And that's where the value is in having a club or a community like yours.
You're absolutely right. And it was really top of mind when I started this thing that when I was at Creative Review as a journalist, there was always a bit of a wall there where people wanted to put on their best face. And it always frustrated me that it was really, really hard to get them to talk about the nitty gritty and the really tough stuff.
Right.
What I wanted was the kind of conversations people would have on their WhatsApp groups or in the pub or in a cafe where they would really kind of share what they're going through. But I think there's something about that context of a title like Creative Review that made people really wary because they just thought, oh gosh, it's going to be so kind of official and everyone's going to read it and I can't possibly talk about the bad things. I just need to talk about the good stuff. So I wanted us to somehow create an atmosphere where people would participate, where you don't just go along to hear a speaker as an audience member, but you get to take part. And that's always a kind of really key element of what we do, where we may kick something off with a Q&A or a panel or something, but then we'll go into small groups and then we'll have that kind of guided discussion. And that's where people can really talk to one another and open up with one another. And as I say, sometimes I'm kind of astounded about how transparent people actually are. And I think, oh, shit, do you really want to be saying that? But it's amazing that, that is, as you say, that's where people get the most value from something like this, which is having that ability to talk to their peers. And also why we wanted to keep it at that kind of leadership level, because we wanted people to feel like I'm going to be in a room with people that really understand what I'm going through. And I can hopefully really learn from them and I can make really good contacts that are going to be really useful for me. Because when so many people join in-house agencies from external agency land, I think they often find that the role is actually quite different and the networks that they relied on in their previous jobs are maybe not quite as useful and relevant, and they need to build some new relevance to new networks to help them cope with the different demands that you have as an in-house agency leader. So really to try and create that sort of support network, I guess. Sometimes people say, oh, this is like group therapy. And, there is an element of that. There's a big element as well as of validation in what we do. So just to know that you're not alone, to know that the solutions that you've hit on or the routes that you've hit on, other people are doing the similar thing, is really, really important for people. I think that validation piece is a real key element of what we provide, I think.
I think group therapy is a good way to describe it because I was meeting with the head of brand and creative at a fairly well-known brand a couple of weeks ago, and we are talking about their creative briefing process, and it was almost like they were, ashamed of what they were sharing, and I was like, no, I mean, 100%. And I actually said there should probably be like in-house agency leaders or a creative operations anonymous group where people could stand up and say, I'm an in-house agency leader and we have a really bad briefing process, and everybody would stand
Briefing,
up.
time and time again, briefing is the number one thing that comes up.
Exactly.
It's so difficult for people to get right. I think it's added complexity in-house where you've got maybe loads of stakeholders who aren't used to working within a creative agency, or maybe they've been used to working with a internal creative resource that is now trying to evolve into something different and is asking different things of them. And there's so much kind of bad process in discipline, people briefing stuff by email, by going over and standing at someone's desk, and getting the kind of cultural piece of getting past that and trying to introduce rigor and discipline is really hard, because people who work in in-house agencies that I see want to be great colleagues and they want to go the extra mile and they want to help. So it's quite difficult for them to suddenly turn around and say, actually, no, we have a process now. You've got to fill this form out, otherwise we're not doing it. But it really is for everyone's benefit in the long term. But it's a culturally really difficult shift, I think, for some of them to make.
Well, we're going to talk about culture, like in-housing culture. So let's sort of dig into the meat of this. Like, this has been great context to learn about you and the organization, especially for those in North America that may not be familiar with it. Definitely familiar with a lot of these brands that you mentioned, like Lego and Sainsbury's and others. So let's dig into the meat of this because I think, this episode, I really want to leave in-house leaders, creative operations leaders, with questions they should be asking themselves. And I think you, in your background, especially in setting up this organization and the conversations that you've been in the middle of and been able to observe over the last few years, give you a unique perch. So where I want to start with is, we've seen the data and the reports that there's been this trend towards in-housing. And there is this burgeoning conversation over the last 12, 24 months that in-house teams are starting to make this transition, and some have, from being sort of a service desk, tactical, more doers, to being more strategically oriented. So just sort of talk us through, like, why do you think that is happening? And maybe thinking back to those initial Zoom calls back during the COVID days to today, like, what are the changes that you've seen? What are the different sorts of conversations that are happening? And why is this happening? Like, what are the business drivers like pushing this?
So I think there's some basic logic at heart, which is to do with the way that marketing has changed. So the way in which brands communicate to people has changed fundamentally. Everyone knows that. And it plays into, I think, some of the strengths of in-house agencies. So when you are, moving to always on, and where you need to produce vast amounts of content, you need to do it quickly, you need to do it efficiently, they play into the strengths of in-house teams to be able to produce that content at scale. So there's a kind of logic at the base of why people have taken so much of that function in-house. And then what they find, I think, is once they start making that stuff work, then it's like, well, hang on a minute, we could be doing more here. Why don't we try and do some of this work that we're currently using an external agency for? Or maybe we could take on that, because we've now built this incredible brand knowledge and control, and we could be using that in other ways. So what we kind of see is a lot of in-house teams are on an evolutionary journey. So the way we've sort of tried to help people understand where they may be is there's kind of four pots that you could place most in-house teams, in-house agencies, whatever you want to call them in. So starting from production studio, sort of doing really kind of basic lower tier work, maybe even just doing stuff like internal comms or decks for people, really small studio. Then you've got, maybe they'll add some design function. They'll start doing some basic kind of origination work. So they become more like a creative studio. And then the next kind of evolutionary step is towards a creative agency, where they're bringing in conceptual teams. They may be bringing in strategists. They may be bringing in producers. They may be originating the kind of tier 2, tier 3 campaigns, maybe even originating brand campaigns. And then the kind of final evolutionary step is what we would call lead agency, like Specsavers. And I think a lot of in-house leaders, because they've sort of proved their worth at the bread and butter work, then look up to see, well, actually, we could be doing more. We could evolve along that spectrum to become a creative agency, maybe even to become a lead agency. But I think what I'm super careful of is not sort of trying to promulgate this idea that everybody should be on that journey, or everybody should be aiming to be this or that, because everybody does it differently. Everybody's driven by the particular needs of their business. Everybody has a remit that makes sense to them and their own circumstances. So if the right thing for you is to be what we might call a creative studio, because that makes sense for you as a business, and you've got great external partners that can do your big brand campaigns or your social or whatever, brilliant. We're not going to denigrate people who are decided that that's the right stop for them. And sometimes, people will go one step further and then come back again because it didn't quite work for them, or maybe there's a change of leadership that didn't believe in what they were trying to do. So although I think there is this sort of evolutionary path that a lot of in-house teams are on, it's really important to sort of stress that there's no right or wrong here. It's all about what's right for you as a business. But I definitely feel like as people prove their worth, and then that then unlocks doors. So, I mean, a really good example is I was talking last week with the team from the National Lottery here in the UK. That's now run by a company called Allwyn. And they were telling me about how they have identified a sort of particular type of work that's currently being done by an external agency. And they've agreed with stakeholders that they could run a pilot to show what that work would look like if they did it themselves. They're bringing some freelance talent to support that. But what they're trying to do is again, kind of prove a case study, a test case, and all going well, they will then do that work as part of the internal team. So they are kind of building out capability by a sort of test and learn process. And we see that a lot with other in-house teams as they kind of realize, and as the business realizes, and a lot of times I think it's about identifying some allies within the organization that like what you do and will maybe give you a kind of brief which goes beyond what your current remit is, just to see whether you can do it. And then they get this kind of snowball effect where other stakeholders will say, oh, you did that project for so-and-so, that was great. Can I have one of those? Can you do one of those for me? And almost organically, this thing kind of evolves and builds, which is really super exciting for in-house agency leaders, because it just does unlock the potential of what they see themselves doing in future.
I really like that model of the 4 buckets, because I think very often in-house leaders, creative ops leaders, and I'll just use those terms or roles interchangeably if I could. I've been thinking a lot about this lately, especially as everyone's doing their planning for next year. And what I've been thinking about is right answers, wrong questions. And I think very often in-house teams, like, they think they're one thing, but they don't ask the question of what do we actually need to be for the business. So the value of putting yourself into one of those 4 buckets and the right bucket for the business, and then validating that with, whether it's your marketing counterparts or the leadership team, I think would be incredibly valuable. And then I think it also helps an in-house leader start to think through, for any one of those 4 buckets, what are the KPIs that actually matter? Because it's going to be different, especially if you inhabit all 4 buckets simultaneously, like a Specsavers. And then also, who's your competition? Because your competition in that first bucket, doing more of that production work, is going to be an outsourced partner or an offshoring agency or something like that, or it's going to be AI now. Is what is happening, versus, the last bucket where you're doing more of that strategy work really embedded in the business. Your competition is those external agencies that go, oh, but we work with like all kinds of businesses. So we bring that context of the whole world that you perhaps don't have internally. And then maybe that sort of, that in-house agency leaders thinking about, how do we sort of get that same sort of context and bring that understanding into the business? Are you seeing organizations sort of use that 4 bucket model, or is that something? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. We found that people have really latched onto that and found it really helpful to kind of validate what they're doing. And also, I think you make a really important point there about, well, KPIs is really important. So when you talk about cost and efficiency, there's all manner of metrics you can use to prove that, and it's kind of quite straightforward and clean to prove. If we do this project, we will deliver it at 30% less than what it would cost you if you went to an external agency, because we know what their rates are. We've used them in the past. We can show that value really easily. I think where a lot of in-house teams are struggling is to find really useful metrics to prove the other stuff, the creative effectiveness, the brand knowledge that they have. So it's why sometimes I think it's easy for in-house agencies to default to the cost effectiveness and efficiency model, because that's how they can most easily show their value, right? But to take that step up, how are you going to show the value of us doing the big Christmas campaign versus the external agency doing it? How are we going to show that beyond cost? And I think, a lot of people are struggling. They'll use the familiar kind of tools around things like brand sentiment and that sort of stuff, but it's not as clean and as obvious and as easy to make the case back to the business as it is when you can show a cost saving. And, even when people are trying to expand their remit and making the case for it based on brand knowledge and creative effectiveness and better work, I think oftentimes the easiest way to make that argument is to the business to get the investment is to go in with cost saving first, because anybody who's worked in a big organization knows nothing works as well as just saying, we're going to save you a load of money here. So that can be almost like a Trojan horse, I think, to get something through, even if you think the real value you're going to be providing is actually because you can do better work that understands the brand better. And it's not just about cost saving, but cost saving certainly helps.
Yeah, I think I liked your term there, useful metrics. And I think KPIs and metrics and data have always sort of been this black box for in-house teams and creative ops leaders, and almost something that many have ignored, I believe, to their detriment, even leveraging it in the creative process. But I do think we're in a time where they need to be embraced much more. We need to have much more nuanced thinking around what KPIs matter, depending on what type of in-house team you are and what matters to the business. And I think especially with AI here, perhaps not ready for prime time in all of its capabilities, but I think KPIs that are still rooted in scale, speed, and cost, those are still going to matter. But the AI has created new creative production math, I believe, because now scale, speed, and cost efficiency are going to have, press the easy button and you can scale 100x. You could cut your speed by 90% and cut your cost. I think it has all sorts of interesting implications for at least two of those buckets. Actually, I think there's implications across all four buckets, and we are going to have much different conversations and thinking around KPIs.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, what does seem to work quite well is when in-house team has the same KPIs as their marketing colleagues. So
Yes.
then, it's one team. We're working to the same
Yeah.
same goals, and we can sort of celebrate those together. That definitely works. But yeah, you're absolutely right with, the rise of first automation and then AI is going to fundamentally change that. And I think coming back to your point about leaders thinking about what they are there to do, I'm going to steal something I saw on LinkedIn today from Kevin Lynch, who used to be creative director at Oatly, and is now running his own agency. And he was talking about this thing of are we heads or hands? So are we thinking or doing? And I think a lot of in-house teams started off as hands, but more and more they're realizing that actually their true value is as heads. And we've seen some really interesting examples recently where the hands part has been actually outsourced and the heads part is being retained. So really good example of that recently is John Lewis partnership. So big retailer here in the UK, John Lewis also has Waitrose, had a really big internal team of about 120 people doing lots of the not bread and butter work that you would imagine for a retailer. But they found that they were being very inefficient. Long story short, they have outsourced a lot of that doing work to an external provider, ITG. But what they've retained is creative, strategic, and production leadership. So they have retained the kind of heads bit as John Lewis Partnership core team. And I guess, there's lots of really interesting arguments for doing that, not least that more and more of that work is going to become automated and driven by AI. Very difficult for in-house teams to make the kind of investment in AI that maybe some of these external production partners can do, the likes of ITG or Brand Tech or whoever, because it's their business to be doing that. So there is some logic in outsourcing that issue, that problem, if you like, to
Yep.
an external partner for whom it's their core business.
Yeah, this has sort of come up in discussions recently with a couple of folks from the outsourcing and offshoring world. And my prediction is we're going to see round tripping of this work. So to your point of that, let's say tier two, tier three production work, as it's often categorized, I think that'll increasingly get outsourced because there's advantages, cost, speed, being able to run 24/7. And I think now in this time of AI, it's not only the technical capabilities, it's also internally having to navigate legal and IT
Oh yeah.
complexities. It's almost easier to like outsource your AI sandbox for production needs to external partners, let them do the work, let them prove the value. But I do think that eventually that comes back in house. And I almost think of, for one primary reason, AI's got to be closer to the data, and everyone is locking down their data now for many reasons. And I think that AI is going to be the new outsourcing. And we'll have a time where it sits externally because of all the reasons we've mentioned. But I do wonder, and I do think, and I'd be willing to bet on, eventually it comes back in house.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it does beg the question then of what happens to those kinds of production businesses that are currently serving this market. Where does their future lie? We've seen some really interesting examples of some companies really kind of making a holistic investment in AI. So Reckitt springs to mind. The home products company has lots of different brands. I don't think they've gone public on this yet, but as I understand it, they are building their own in-house AI system fed by their own data. And their take on it seems to be actually that they're looking at AI across the whole thing. So how do we use it for market research? What does that tell us about what the future of our brands and our business should
Yeah.
look like? What kind of brand extensions could we be doing? And eventually, what do they look like? What would the packaging look like? But they're looking at it across the piece, and as you say, that access to data to be able to inform that kind of thinking and those sorts of decisions is probably where it's going to have a much bigger impact for organizations than the stuff that's kind of tended to dominate the headlines, which has been the Gen AI creation of images and video, which obviously people are kind of excited / terrified about,
Right.
but is maybe not where those systems are going to get applied as much as they are in other areas of the business, and really help, as you say, kind of inform decision making and the future of some of those brands.
Yeah, I think the way we're thinking about AI now in terms of its application is really just surface level. I
Yeah,
think of it as like we're just sprinkling AI spice on what we've always been doing. Um,
exactly.
and the real opportunity is to just sort of refactor it. If I could borrow a term from the development world, we just need to tear everything apart and like pull all the Lego blocks apart and put them back together in entirely new ways because we have new elements on the periodic table. So the possibilities have changed and there's new math for everything. And I think once we start to get to that, that's where the real implications will come. And unlike, I understand where the fear is coming from in terms of potential job loss. I don't think it's going to be job loss. I do believe there's going to be more jobs created, but it is going to be massive job dislocation, even in the creative process. Like I'm already starting to see because of some of these AI enabled creative automation tools like Brand Tech and others are doing. Um, that there is starting to be a blending of roles across like paid media, marketing, and creative. And that's like just an early signal of the type of dislocation we're going to see in creative and that in-house leaders are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, and I think actually it's from a creative point of view, that's where it's really exciting.
Yes.
So, I'm old enough to remember when I was working on a magazine when desktop publishing came in, and suddenly that whole ecosystem of how you produced a print magazine when you used to have repro and you were scanning slides and marked up artwork and all of that stuff just got turned upside down almost overnight. And suddenly the art director could do all of that stuff that 15 people in specialist roles used to do. So armed with, in those days, PageMaker and Quark Express, and then latterly InDesign, their role completely changed. And something similar is going to happen for sure. And the other kind of reference I would make as well is the early days of digital. So when internet happened, when Java happened, when you had really exciting creative people like Antirom, who I don't know if your audience would remember them, that they were a collective that you just used to kind of get into these tools, break them, see what happens when you break these things and use them in ways that are completely unintended.
Yes.
That's when really exciting stuff will start to happen. Because you're right. I mean, at the moment, AI is just being used to kind of replicate what we already know, but maybe faster and cheaper. But actually, it's capable of so much more. So when artists and creative people really start tinkering with this stuff and getting under the bonnet of it and bringing in data and being able to produce stuff live and really personalize things, there's going to be some very, very exciting new ways of engaging with the audiences, reaching us as human beings, touching us, that we've not kind of thought of yet. And to me, that's why a lot of creative people are actually super excited about this. And the work that's been seen so far, like the Gen AI image making, there's an illustration style that's come out, which to my mind is just, it's like the worst computer generated illustration that came out when people first started getting Macs, and it had that awful kind of no emotion or really flat. Everything starts to look the same. But eventually, people then started, really digging into these tools and breaking these tools and seeing what would happen. And hopefully, that's the same as going to happen in AI creatively.
I think we're definitely going to see that, and I think as I use a term, the true creatives who are embedded in storytelling and creating emotional connection and resonance with the audience through their work will embrace this and they
Yeah.
will love it. I think those that perhaps are more deeply rooted in paint by numbers production work, that is just pre-algorithm in my opinion. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And you wrote a really interesting post on LinkedIn about what those roles and what that creative team might look like in
Yeah,
the future. And I think it's that's where it's really exciting. It's like we've imported this logic based on what people like Bill Bernbach were doing in the 50s with copywriting and art directing teams. We've not really broken out of that. In the early days of digital, some of the new breed of agencies were trying to break that, and they were putting together teams where you would have a creative technologist, a developer, a writer, an art director, a media analyst together working as one. But it didn't seem to have taken hold in the way it might have done. And I think a lot of in-house agencies or in-house teams have imported the ways of working of external agencies for some good reasons. But the exciting thing for me is that they're not reliant on those kind of legacy business models to make their money. So this might actually be a real exciting opportunity for in-house agencies to reinvent what that looks like, because they don't have to make money from the things that external agencies need to make money from.
that is a fantastic point. I think external agencies who are set up as a business, the the thing that's not being said out loud is what is really going to change is the economic model, and that is the hardest thing to navigate. You could deal with like new technology, new types of roles, blending roles. That's complicated on its own, but when the economic model changes, that um, that is so fundamental as to cause cognitive dissonance. And I think that is going to be a struggle and challenge. And the article you mentioned for the listeners, I posed the question, if I were to start an in-house agency tomorrow, here's some of the roles I would have on the team, and I'll include a link in the show notes. And Emma Sexton and I are going to be talking about that and just sort of having a nerd out session in a few weeks on that, and we'll see what other roles we might come up with through that.
Yeah, it
But
should be really exciting. And I think, it's just some people aren't so happy that their in-house agency is a cost center, but this might actually be where being a cost center rather than profit center is an advantage, because you can maybe jump off that wheel a lot easier because you're not having to maintain a profit model that no longer makes sense.
yeah, cost center, but and this will be a good segue back into something I wanted to pick up on, a cost center that is still firmly rooted in generating value. So going
Yeah,
back to those KPIs across the four buckets, and one thing you said earlier was, you know, aligning KPIs with marketing KPIs or organizational KPIs. And I've long been an advocate of that. Again, scale, speed, cost, all those things matter, but they should be in the service of business impact. Like every role in the org chart, every team on the org chart should be in service of business impact. Sometimes it's not a clear line of sight, but that is the job of the in-house leader, is to find that line between what we do on the in-house team and business impact. And that sort of opens up a broader conversation around trust and like building trust, gaining permission, as you're talking about before, to perhaps move through those buckets if you want to. And and this is also tied to something else I've seen, and there's been a little bit of chatter on LinkedIn recently, and I'm also a LinkedIn addict like you, just constantly scrolling it. I always tell my friends I'm not on Instagram or TikTok or all those other time wasters, and they're like, "Let's see your LinkedIn usage." And I'm like,
yeah,
"Okay," but it's for business. So on that note of like trust and KPIs and what I was talking about, like what I've been seeing on LinkedIn, do you position yourself as um, are you an in-house agency, or do you also have a brand? Like more and more, I've seen some of these in-house agencies come out with their brand. And I've even seen a couple who are now offering their services externally, which to me seems um, counterintuitive, especially if they want to move into bucket four.
yeah.
Yeah. So, what are your
I think
thoughts?
the branding and naming thing is really interesting. So we see quite a real split there, where some people very much go down that route of uh, branding their internal team. So, for example, Sainsbury's, as they reinvented themselves from being a internal team that was a production team that had kind of come out of a history of um, shooting and producing printed catalogs for a retail business, now want to be seen as being an internal agency. Um, so they felt like naming themselves Zest and having their own identity was a really important part in trying to communicate to stakeholders what's going to be different now. We are going to, we're working a different way now. We want to work with you in a different way. And I think what people find is that when they do brand themselves and name themselves in that way, it helps internally for the creatives in particular to feel like they are part of something different, that they can build that internal culture. And it helps, I guess, with the expectations of them from the rest of the business. People who are maybe used to deal with an external agency, maybe it makes more sense for them now to feel like, okay, so now I get it. You are an agency just like Mother's an agency, or Saatchi's are an agency, or so on. The kind of counter argument is that it's putting up some false barriers, and the whole point of being in-house is your colleagues, not clients. You can work together, you can collaborate. Why are we putting up this kind of barrier between us and them? And I think that's a really, really interesting argument. Depends a lot on the organization. I know, for example, from speaking to an ex-creative director at BBC Creative, that he was saying he felt like he'd done some of the best work in his career because there was no barrier between him as a creative director and his marketing colleagues, and he could have those conversations on a level. Another really interesting example is Marks and Spencer, the big retailer here. On their foods business, they have an internal team run by a guy called Robbie Black, who is adamant that they are not in an agency. They're not an in-house agency. They're part of the marketing team. They have a very small team there, him, creative director, head of production, and then they work with freelancers and they work with production companies because, again, he didn't want to kind of bring in some of the worst aspects of external agencies, and he didn't want to create those barriers. So there's a really interesting kind of argument for and against there. I think a lot of the time it probably depends on where you're at on your journey, if you're on a journey, because if you want to signal that we're no longer just a service, we are operating as a strategic partner, branding yourselves differently, looking a bit different, physically having a different environment when people come in, I think can be a real help. I think it also goes back as well to that use of the word agency, which implies certain ways of behaving and being. And Specsavers is a really interesting example here, where I think it was earlier this year, they renamed themselves from having been called the agency at Specsavers to being called Specsavers Creative, because what they wanted internally was to be seen as another strategic department alongside logistics or finance, or to have that kind of level of respect that we have a core area of expertise, which is around creativity. Your finance department has a core expertise, which is around finance and financial analysis. And we want to be seen as working with you, not in service to you. So they felt like that name change was a really important kind of signal of where they got to in terms of we want to be involved at higher, further upstream in solving business problems rather than just being seen as the recipients of marketing briefs.
That's really interesting because sort of as you're sharing all that, I was thinking about a few things, and I'm going to try and remember some of the articles you've written from the events and pull a couple of bits together. One is I wonder if across those four buckets, and I'd really love to turn this into like an infographic actually with those four buckets and talk about KPIs and things. Maybe we could do that offline
Yeah.
together. But these four buckets, if somebody does need to name, so one is, I think if you brand yourself as an internal agency with a name like Zest or like Acme Agency, then I do wonder if that gets in the way of building trust and like the trust that you need to actually get really embedded into the business and no longer have internal teams look externally. Two is if you still do need, if it is a signal, and do see, the rationale in that, do you sort of, would it make sense to like name yourself as like Acme Production Studio, Acme Creative Studio, and then all the way to like Acme Strategic Agency in bucket number four? And then is there a bucket number five that Specsavers sits in? And here I'm thinking back to, I think it was Lego, because they also don't wait for the brief. They really have embedded themselves in the business. Because to me, and this also goes back to that LinkedIn article I wrote, I think we're going to see more creative strategists on in-house teams. And to me, a creative strategist is not somebody that's going like, okay, marketing has a need for a campaign. How do we turn that in? How do we sort of combine that with our brand guidelines and create something like emotionally resonant? It is about like, where is the business today? Where is it going? And let's get in the room like real creative strategists and consultants, because creative isn't just like, and I'm going to oversimplify things here and probably piss some people off going, it's not just about making pretty things that are emotionally resonant. It's again business impact, and like it's understanding the problems, the market dynamics, and like co-creating what are we going to become next. So is there a fifth bucket, and is that bucket like we're a creative strategy agency embedded and like integrated into the business, like any
Absolutely.
function?
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to Specsavers is a really good example there, where we had a conversation earlier this year with last year actually with Liz Baines, who's their head of strategy, come into the business from external agency land. And what I think really excited her was, as a strategist, suddenly there's this huge landscape beyond helping with marketing tasks. So she would have conversations with, some of their franchisees or with their logistics people, or really, she could almost kind of pick and choose where she was going to focus her talents as a strategist across the whole business. So way beyond just marketing. And that is where we get into really exciting and interesting territory. I think, what does it mean to have that creative resource and expertise and knowledge within a business? And going back to LinkedIn again, because we are the LinkedIn addicts, there was a piece I was just seeing today actually from a guy called Steve Walls, who is a strategist, kind of bemoaning the fact that for strategists, life within an external agency is actually really limiting. And where they could be bringing their skills to bear is in solving business challenges. But because serious clients aren't looking to their advertising agencies for strategic direction, they're looking to them for some ads, as he said. They don't get to stretch themselves and spread their wings. And within a business, they could be doing that. I think there's a very interesting, possibly kind of salutary comparison here, and an interesting kind of, not necessarily a fight, but something to be resolved between what we're talking about, which is kind of creativity, which is coming from really a kind of advertising and content lens, versus design. So in 2018, McKinsey came out with this big piece of research called The Business Value of Design. We can send a link to listeners afterwards. And what they were trying to do is prove that where businesses invested in design at a senior level and linked design outcomes to financial outcomes, there was a measurable uplift in revenue and in stakeholder value from investing in design. And out of that, they really built this case for the chief design officer at a C-suite level as being fundamental to the success of forward-thinking businesses. And I remember at the time when it came out, a load of people in the design world were like, finally, we've been trying to say this for years, that design and the way design works by being led by human insights, being led by research, being led by what the user needs, is the way forward for businesses. We've been trying to say this for a long time. No one listening to us. Finally, because McKinsey is saying it, it's going to unlock the kind of businesses finally going to kind of understand and buy into design in a big way. We're all going to have chief design officers. It's all going to be amazing. Of course, it didn't really happen. Right. I think for some tech businesses where those chief design officers were coming from the kind of digital product roles, UX, UI roles, they were sort of fundamentally to the way the business operated. There was more success there, but we didn't really see that transformation, and we didn't really see that chief design officer role at that C-suite level in the way that they were hoping. One other kind of really interesting idea that came out of that research, and a follow-up piece they did a couple of years later in terms of how to make design effective and have impact within an organization, one of their key suggestions, which came back from their research, was to embed designers in multi-disciplinary teams to get them out of the design department and into the business. So, and what they said was, when you did that, designers felt like they were more respected for their views. They weren't just seen as being the people that made things look nice. They were being seen as being fundamentally part of the team that solved business problems. And so I wonder whether that's a model for in-house agencies to think about as well. What would it look like if actually our people were dispersed into the business as part of multidisciplinary teams, rather than building this kind of walled agency culture where we have our own space and our own name and our own brand, and people kind of have to come into us rather than us going out to them. And I think, that where the kind of value is in design versus, let's say, creative and creativity is really interesting for businesses. And obviously, people on the design side would say it should be us that leads because we understand people and what they need and how they work. And there are businesses, and again, I mentioned Reckitt earlier. There seems to be some really interesting work being done there by Josh Harrison and his team that has seemed to have really kind of elevated the impact and the value of the design teams there, where they are now, as I understand it, really engaged with thinking about the future of the business and the future of the brands that the business has at a very kind of high level. So they've really been able to take that lead with design almost playing that kind of having that primacy within the business.
I could talk for the next like 7 hours about this because, but I do want to say I won't because I want to get back to a couple of other things related to the main topic. But I think, and the listeners will go, "Oh, great, he's going off another AI tangent," and I am. But what I will say is. There's a second podcast coming out in the new year called Prompting Humans that will talk much more deeply about this. But what you're touching on is something that I've been thinking a lot about that we're going to be diving into on this Prompting Humans podcast is so one is just related to like design and creative and things like that. I think vocabulary matters so much because vocabulary, like how we name things, including roles, is the way we end up sort of implementing them and practicing them and relating to them. So we've got design and creative has sort of become this big generic catch-all for everything from
Yeah.
doing production work in box number 4 to strategic work in box number in the top box or the box at the other end of the spectrum. And then
Yeah.
maybe we've got this fifth box that's inhabited by the Specsavers and the Legos of the world. And I've talked about this on the podcast, like there's creative work and then there's storytelling. And then I think even brand has sort of gotten diluted into, oh, brand is just the logo and the colors, and you got to make sure those are accurate. Yes, but like brand is actually how somebody internally or externally to an organization experiences that organization. But that's like intersected with storytelling and design and creative strategy. And I do think with AI, it is going to, again, going back to that refactoring, one of my predictions, and I'll just talk about it quickly and then people can tune into the new podcast in the new year. But I think the org chart's going away. I don't think we're going to have an org chart. It could be 10 years, it could be 5 years, who knows? I don't have a crystal ball. But I think the org chart's going away because everyone's going to have these AI capabilities, and we're going to be able to embed a lot of these capabilities into trained LLMs. I was talking to somebody at an agency in the UK yesterday, and they're training an LLM with on how to be an anthropologist to help in the ideation, like creative strategy ideation process. And most people don't have access to an anthropologist. And I don't think I'm even connected to one on LinkedIn. But now, like others on the team are going to be able to access and bring an anthropologist in. So I think what the org chart turns into is basically a cloud of AI agents and tools and a cloud of people with specific skill sets and capabilities and backgrounds and experiences and expertise. And they will self-organize in small teams. To your earlier point of should we embed design and creative across the organization, I think that's going to happen because AI runs on data that is a fuel, and data wants to be liquid and just flow. And that means the organization can no longer be structured around silos, like vertical silos, horizontal silos. It'll also have to be liquid like. And then small teams enabled with these AI tools will organize around opportunities. So I think we are going to see what you're talking about. And if I were an in-house agency leader today in bucket number 4, one of the things I would be pushing my executive team around is doing this proactively before it happens to us so that we can decentralize those creative capabilities across the organization. So you have a creative working with maybe a go to market individual and somebody on the product team to go, okay, how do we go and create like big impact or solve a problem?
Yeah, yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I think you know just coming back to that McKinsey research, what they were suggesting was that the best design teams had designers that were organized with dotted lines to their design department for coming together to share knowledge and talking about what they'd done, but they were doing their work, out in the business, and that really enabled designers to be seen as colleagues and collaborators rather than service providers. And I think that really helps. And I think what you're saying makes an awful lot of sense. And I think I would love it if it helps us get away from creative as a noun. Like, where's the creative? Have we done the creative?
Yes.
That's horrible to me. Almost as horrible as content, because it just demeans. It's such a demeaning term for what is actually a process and should be something magical.
I think you're bang on. It's a demeaning term, I think, for all humans because, like, we are born with innate curiosity and creativity. It just gets diluted through our factory schooling and work systems over time. And I think that's the reason why many people are struggling with AI right now because they're like, oh, I'm actually going to have to give up all the rote work and I'm going to have to be curious and creative again, which is a problem because I think there's a huge creativity, curiosity, and imagination gap right now.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
So I want to come back to in-house building trust. Some of these in-house teams are branding themselves as agencies. The other thing I've been sort of tracking is some of these in-house teams do chargeback, some of them don't. Some have a point system I've seen you write about. Are you seeing a correlation between, I don't know, teams that brand themselves and are they charging back and or have some sort of point system? Or are there any correlations there or any sort of trends or insights you've picked up on during these conversations?
I think there's a correlation around getting away from the all-you-can-eat buffet model. So putting some kind of consequences
Yep.
in to using us as a department. So whether that is, like a wooden dollars model, or whether that's assigning people with a budget of time that they can use, or at least making them aware of the consequences of a request. So, in the bad old days, there would be no consequences to asking for another thing, because the in-house teams operated on this all-you-can-eat model, which makes planning a nightmare, which destroys any kind of good processes. But still, in the research that we've done, it's still quite common for people not to have that stuff. It's still common for people not to have agreements in place, or proper scoping of work before projects start. So there's still kind of lots of bad behavior going on. I think actual money changing hands is very rare, but people are sort of trying to put some sort of measurement in and reporting back on by month, and also to sort of say this kind of project requires this many hours, but your allocation is X. So if we do this, it's going to bust your allocation of time with us. I think where that gets difficult culturally, again, is where maybe you've moved from this model where the in-house agency will just deal with it and just find a way, and that's being a good colleague, to them trying to put some rigor and discipline. And John Lewis, as I mentioned before, is kind of going through this at the moment, I think, because they're working with this external partner. That external partner is putting a cost against every request, which means that the internal team are now at a point where they're having to say to stakeholders, no, you can't do that because we haven't budgeted for it. And stakeholders are going to have to get used to that, and they're maybe not very happy about getting used to that. So it's a difficult kind of cultural shift for some people to make that, I think, around charging. But without it, it's just chaos. So there has to be a kind of happy medium there, I guess.
But isn't the precursor to that what you were talking about before, which is having KPIs that are aligned with, let's just say marketing, because that's who most creative teams are, most closely aligned to in the organization. Because if you do have the shared KPIs, really shared outcomes is what you have, shared impact on the business, then it's more collaborative discussion around processes and how they need to be designed or updated to make sure that the teams are effectively collaborating and communicating and integrating. And then most importantly about, capacity and budgets and things like that, because then the conversation is rooted in shared outcomes versus we have our outcomes, you have your
Yeah.
outcomes, you have your budget, we have our budget, like doing it together because now we are tied to the hip, so to speak.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it seems to be maybe the kind of number one source of frustration with marketers of their in-house teams is when the in-house team doesn't have capacity to do the work that they want to get done in the time that they want to get done. And I was just before I came on this call with you, talking to somebody who runs a production company, who was saying the vast majority of the people who come to them, who have in-house agencies, come to them because they are frustrated about their in-house agencies not having enough resource to do the tasks that they have for them. And that, as you say, comes back to planning and resource, and having the right model where you can flex and be able to, expand to meet demand. So, a lot of that, and this is where the creative operations role is so key in having the systems in place and enabling the planning that can allow teams to stretch when they need to, and be able to tap into whatever resources they need to have on hand to be able to make the work that their partners are asking of them. But some of our research that we did last year really highlighted some problems around this, with huge percentages of ad hoc work coming in that in-house agencies hadn't been necessarily prepared for.
Yeah, and I think it's that ad hoc work that kills you.
Yeah.
But I think it's it continues to be a problem for a couple of reasons. One is um, it's a problem because it's not called out, and then sort of like we're at year end now. I think, and I might be doing an episode on this later this week, but I think every in-house team and creative ops leader should be doing a Spotify style year-end wrap up. Like, here's what we did, here's what went well, here's what didn't go well. You could also use an AI tool called Suno to have background music as people are playing back the report or something like that. But and then sort of again collaboratively working with your counterparts in marketing to go, okay, how do we make this better? Is there a planning issue? And then how do I, as the in-house leader, build in enough like flexibility so that we can deal with the fires, and that every fire, like we're not in constant firefighting mode. We've got some capacity and we've got less firefighting mode then. So I think that's something that needs to be done. And the other thing I'd love your perspective on is, regardless of what bucket an in-house team is in, should they be looking at like marketing performance data? Because I think again, making that trend, even if you are in that production bucket, should you be should you be evaluating the request through the lens of, you've asked for this before, we've done it, and it didn't have any impact in market. And even if we don't have shared KPIs right now, we want to make sure we're spending our capacity on things that matter. And does that then sort of give them sort of better visibility as a strategic partner, even if they are in that production bucket and not
Yeah,
looking to move yet?
definitely. And I think that is a way in which people can transform the nature of how they're perceived in the business. And it's like when you make the shift to being saying, we're going to be an agency now, part of the deal is, oh, and by the way, we're going to have an opinion now, and we're going to challenge you on some of these things, and we're going to push back on some of these things. And we might well say, well, we tried that before and it didn't perform. So how about this instead? And I think equipping themselves with the ammunition to be able to do that is so important. And it is still quite kind of weird and slightly horrifying for me, some of the stories I hear about how little data in-house teams have access to in terms of things like even knowing how long things take. Not everyone's got systems set up that give them really robust data around stuff like that. Never mind, performance in the market. I think another really interesting aspect of this, which is emerging, is around the sheer waste in terms of how many assets are being produced and how many of those assets never get used by anyone. So we've seen some data on the really, really high percentage of assets that get produced, sit on a dam somewhere, and never ever get used by anyone. So it's a huge waste of time. It's hugely wasteful from a sustainability point of view. And some in-house teams within organizations that have made big commitments around net zero are kind of looking at this and saying, how can we cut our carbon footprint? Well, maybe we need to stop making so much stuff because everything that you make carries a carbon footprint with it. And some people are beginning to incentivize and put some KPIs around reuse of existing assets.
Yep.
So we've heard about this from apparently one big sports company is doing this. So at that briefing point, it's, well, do we already have something which we've made before, which we could use to answer this brief? That should be a question that we ask right at the beginning. And again, I think it should be an advantage that in-house agencies have versus external agencies, because of course, external agencies, the whole business model is predicated on making new stuff that you can put a margin on. Whereas an in-house agency can say, well, we've already made something here which we think will work just as well. Let's reuse that. And there's been lots of really interesting research around recently that marketers think that people get very tired of ideas and campaigns and work much more quickly than they actually do. So you can run stuff for longer, but you can also reuse things without any kind of negative effects. So I think that's another kind of string to the bow, I think, of in-house teams to be slightly more challenging and to say, as you mentioned, maybe this thing didn't work properly last time we did it, so maybe we should do it in a different way. But also, you're asking for something new here. You're asking for a shoot, but actually we think we could reuse something which is just sat on a dam somewhere, and we can do this much more efficiently and effectively and save a lot of money in the process.
Yeah, and I think it's by doing things like that you build that trust.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of your speakers or what you've picked up on from the community events that you've done, they talk a lot about like trust is in showing up and doing good work. Trust is in showing up and asking the right questions and then coming up with the right answers. So as you said, it could be as simple as, oh, we've done this before. We could just pull it and it won't take 3 weeks. We can get it out by tomorrow now. And we saved capacity for something else that does require net new.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Patrick, we've been going on for a while now. I could talk to you for hours on end. I'd like to wrap up on two things. One is maybe you could just talk a little bit about the event, the last event of the year that you're doing tomorrow, because I think it's a lovely event that you've planned and something that more in-house teams should be doing for themselves and perhaps with each other. And then two is, tell us a little bit about like, what are some of the topics, challenges, opportunities you're thinking about that you're going to convene the community around starting in 2025?
Thanks. Well, yeah. So tomorrow, we talk a lot about things like process. We talk a lot about culture, talent. I felt like we don't talk enough about the work, and that the work of in-house agencies isn't as visible as it could and should be. And I think in-house agencies are always, working at such pace, they don't always have time to stop and share the work that they do and celebrate the work that they do. So tomorrow, what we decided to do is a different type of event where I've just reached out to the community and said, come and show us a piece of work. Come and show us a piece of work and tell us why this represents you and your team at our best. What is it that you feel represents you at your best through this piece of work? So we're going to do it really rapid fire, Petra style, like 10 minutes each. Show us a piece of work. Tell us the idea behind it, why you went down this route, and why it represents you at your best. We've got a whole array of people coming to show work from Sky. We've got Three. We've got John Lewis. We've got Expedia. We've got Tottenham Hotspurs Football Club. It's going to be really, really exciting and very different, and something I want to do more of. In fact, I'm thinking maybe every in-person event, we should start off with just like 2 campaigns from 2 of the members of the community. Show us something really quickly about what you've been working on, and let's see the incredible array of work that in-house agencies do. And then in terms of the new year, we've been doing a bit of research recently with members about what they want more from us. And there's some kind of topics which are evergreen, you know, things like the right workflow tech and how you operationalize tech is really, really difficult. Managing digital advertising and things like that. But also, I think we've so far done most of our events. We've brought the kind of leadership team together. So operations leaders, creative leaders, production strategy. There's some demand for us to actually focus in a bit more and maybe do some things which are more specific to roles. So a couple of weeks ago, we did a fantastic session with a very, very good, experienced ECD called Mick Mahoney, looking at what qualities you need to be a successful creative director and how you develop those qualities, because creative director is arguably the most important role within a creative team, but people end up doing it because they're good at making work, not necessarily good at managing other people. And there's very little training and development for creative directors. So what could that look like? Maybe we might look at doing some more sessions that are just for that creative director community, where they can really kind of focus in on their own needs. The other thing we want to do as well is, much as I value what we've created in terms of being this safe space, being this kind of group therapy where people can kind of come together and unburden themselves of some of the difficulties, what would be healthy, I think, would be to bring some stakeholders, bring some marketers into the conversation and ask them, what drives you crazy about your in-house team? What do you want from them? What are they not giving you? How can we kind of work together to resolve if there are issues here? Or just where can we show value in the future? How can we work effectively together? So to bring in that community, and maybe also to bring in some of the external agencies that in-house teams still work with. So some agencies, some design consultancies, and talk about how that relationship is evolving and changing and what makes for good, effective collaboration in that space as well. So maybe without losing kind of what makes it really special, which is that safe space, we can bring in some really important external partners into the conversation as well and start exploring how to work together in the best way.
I love that. I love that you've got these different perspectives because, again, going back to right answers, wrong questions, I think you get to the right questions, right answers, which is obviously a better way to approach things when you hear those different perspectives, and you could do it in a way that is, to use your term, safe, collaborative, open, your community is really, it occurs to me, really rooted in transparent learning, and learning gets accelerated with the more transparency there is. And if that could be done in a respectful, collaborative, safe way, then the in-house agency leaders that are part of your community are going to be so much further along in 12 months than they are today.
Yeah, let's hope so.
All right. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for joining us today. I've had a ton of fun with this conversation.
Me too. I'm very honored and flattered to be asked. So thank you so much, Nish.
Yeah, learned so much. And I think the audience is, I'm looking forward to getting this episode out to them because I think they're going to get a ton of value from this. So thank you again for doing this with me today.
Thank you for asking me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Hey, folks. Nish back again, just me. That was a great conversation with Patrick. I really enjoyed it. This is the reflection questions segment. I record this usually 2, 3 days after the interview with my guest. So I've had an opportunity to sort of reflect on the episode, what I heard, what I learned. And these are sort of my shower thoughts or out on my walk thoughts or sitting quietly and having my coffee thoughts and package it up as a series of questions. I usually end up writing out like 10, 20, 30 questions that the episode, the conversation with my guest prompted me to think about. And it sort of helps me like go from just listening mode to thinking mode, and then hopefully from that thinking mode to doing mode. Hope it's valuable for you as well. And I'm not going to share all like I think I've got 22 questions here that my conversation with Patrick inspired me to write down. I'm going to just to share a couple of them with you. Hopefully, they're valuable for you. If you want to talk about any one of these with me, more than happy to. You could DM me on LinkedIn, or if you've got my email or phone number, you could email or text me as well. Or if you wanted some of the other questions, more than happy to share those with you as well. So I'll go ahead and share a couple. And again, I hope that sort of this helps you like prompt some discussions with yourself. As you're sitting and quietly having your own coffee in the morning, perhaps, or with your team or with your leadership. So the first one is how does the alignment of creative and marketing KPIs help demonstrate the direct impact of storytelling and brand consistency on ROI? And this really came out of like, I think throughout the conversation with Patrick, we kept coming back to this idea of like measurement and how do you prove the value of the in-house agency. And this has also come up through other conversations on the podcast over the last year and a half. And one of the themes that is coming out is really trying to figure out how to creative KPIs with marketing KPIs. There seems to be more and more consensus and agreement that that is the best way of showing the value of your in-house team, the value of the creative work that is being produced, whether it's production work or more strategic work, is trying to align more with marketing KPIs. Not saying that should be a universal rule, but in a lot of organizations, that's probably going to create better alignment between marketing and creative, and also allow creative to really embed itself as a more strategic internal partner versus what I'll call a doing partner. Even if you're in that production bucket, you can still be a strategic partner with high value impact on the business. But I think it really starts with like, what are our KPIs today? Should they be better aligned with the marketing KPIs? I think that also probably leads to more interesting and valuable discussions with your marketing peers, as well as with marketing executives like the CMO. Another question that I'll pull out here is, you know, it's so I'll read the question first, and then what inspired it is: in what ways could embedding with cross-functional teams amplify the impact of your creative work and foster deeper collaboration? This came out of a broader discussion with Patrick about this idea of like creatives and or designers being embedded across the organization. So instead of just sort of being its own standalone unit, waiting to, get direction or marching orders, if you will, like almost like decentralizing the creative talent pool across the organization, or maybe even before decentralizing people across the organization, maybe even thinking about like decentralizing, like what is our creative mindset, what's our design mindset, and how do we almost like document that, how do we create almost a manifesto around here's how we do creative. I guess it sort of sounds like brand guidelines, but I think it's more than that. Is how do we think creatively? What is that design creative thinking mindset? And how do we embed that across the organization? Yeah, so as I'm sort of thinking out loud here, maybe it starts with that and sort of embedding or decentralizing that mindset and that way of thinking. And does that then also allow the in-house agency to, by embedding and decentralizing the way it does and almost like advising, maybe even indoctrinating others across the organization in that mindset, does that start to position the in-house agency differently? Does a perception start to change from a being seen as a convenient tactical in-house partner and more of a strategic, we can't live without these guys partner? So it's something I've been thinking about. Really intrigued by the idea of almost documenting. Here's how we do creative, and it becomes almost like gospel within the organization, and that can and should really be led by the in-house agency. Um, and I think the other thing I wanted to share here is those were like two key ones, and I think the other one to really think about, especially as like AI, is I felt like over the last 6 months transitioned from, you know, yeah, let's just sort of take a wait and see approach and see what happens to now executive leaders are showing up and going, well, we're coming with the investments in AI platforms and policies, and we're setting up AI councils. So you need to be ready to come to the table with a plan. What's your AI roadmap? What's your AI strategy? Things like that. And before you can sort of run, you've crawl and walk, of course. So the question I've got down here is, what pilot projects or small wins could you pursue to demonstrate the ability of the creative team to um, lead with AI? What are those experiments you want to design to start to understand how you can leverage AI to scale, how you can leverage AI to tell more impactful, compelling stories to your audience? And how do you really unleash the power of your storytellers? And how do you also use AI to scale, and how do you balance that? So what are the pilot projects or small experiments and the small wins that you could start with to start to walk down the AI path? Because again, I think more and more organizations have realized and understand that this is not a question of if, it's just a question of when and how quickly the AI revolution is going to impact you. So that's what I wanted to share. Like, as I said, just a handful of questions that got prompted by my conversation with Patrick, which I greatly appreciate. There's 20 more questions on my sheet here. Again, if you want to get in touch with me, more than happy to talk about this, share more of the questions with you to, again, help you sort of go from listen mode to thinking mode, and then ideally doing mode. So hope that's valuable. Cheers.